Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 13th meeting of the Disabilities Access and Inclusion Advisory Committee. And before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat, and home to many diverse Indigenous peoples. I hope everyone had a fantastic winter break. I know it's been some time since we last met. Unfortunately, we didn't have our meeting before the conclusion of the holidays, but I'm happy to see that everyone is back safe and sound. We do have two new members who will be joining us. So Councillor Davis, who's taking the place of Councillor Carroll. She's probably running late, and we'll see her shortly. But I want to welcome Monica Winkler, who is back on the committee. Wonderful to have you, Monica. Great. So, are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Okay, seeing none, we'll proceed. Can I have a mover of the minutes of October 27, 2016? Okay. And thank you very much, Tom. All those in favor, indicate your support. Okay, we will now proceed and go through the order paper. We have the chair's report, which I will come back to very shortly. We also have item number 2, DI 13.2, the Disability Access and Inclusion Advisory Committee working groups. We will probably need to hold this down and maybe have a quick discussion about that. I suspect there is still one more opening on transportation group, working group number 4. I'm going to do the very best I can to convince somebody to join that working group so Tom is not by himself. So we'll get to that before the end of the meeting. So I'll hold that down. We are looking forward to a presentation, DI 13.3, the Toronto Sidewalk Cafe Design Manual, and so we'll hold that down for a staff presentation. We also have item number DI 13.4, the 2017 Disability Access and Inclusion Advisory Committee meetings. I think that is straightforward. If there's no one who would like to speak to the item, I think we can just go ahead and move and adopt, as long as we don't have any conflicts with holiday calendars, religious observances. I think the clerks did a pretty good job of checking against that. Okay, Monica, I see you moving into adopt. All those in favor? Okay, so we've got our dates for the 2017 year. Thank you very much. DI 13.5 and an update on the city's multi-year accessibility plan, and we'll hold that for staff presentation. Okay, so what I'd like to do is perhaps vary the order paper and move DI 13.2 to the bottom part of our meeting, if that's all right. No one's okay. I see. Looks there's no objections. I'm moving that right now. We'll make that the last item before we conclude. All those in favor? Okay, and so adopted. Thank you. Okay, so we'll move right into DI 13.3, Toronto Sidewalk Cafe Design Manual. And we have Chris Ronson, who is here to do a presentation. Oh, actually, yeah, before I go ahead and do that, I have to give you my chair's report. There was some activity. Sorry, folks. I'm just so keen for this cafe presentation. I know it's been long anticipated. So I do have 3 items to report back on. The chair's report will be it will be short and brief, but I do think that there's some things that will be coming down the pipeline for us to consider. One is that we talked about the social impacts of the 2017 budget cuts, and this committee had directed us to write a letter to the executive committee to let them know that the 2.6% budget cuts was going to have adverse impacts on people living with disabilities, which we then proceeded to do. There are still some service deficits that I think would have a greater impact, especially for those who are living with disabilities, such as the rise of TTC fare, the wait lists of 190,000 mostly children that are on the wait list for recreation services, continued wait lists for parents who are looking for subsidies for daycare, almost 18,000. For obviously a number of reasons, people living with disabilities already have a number of challenges in terms of accessing city services. Not having enough services to meet the needs of Torontonians is going to have a bigger impact, I think, as we see it on people who are most vulnerable, including the population that we're here to represent. We also had a big discussion in council in December regarding the Sherbourne and Wellesley cycle-track review. If you recall, that item was before this committee at least 2 or 3 times over the last 2 years. We essentially wanted to have staff just take a look at if there was ways to improve the accommodations of accessibility vehicles, just because there was conflicts on the way those vehicles were opening up onto the cycle track. There was a recommendation, if you'll recall, at the Public Works Committee, which basically was going to provide an exemption for vehicles with a disability permit. That did not necessarily sit well with a larger group of individuals, predominantly those who were from the cycling community. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't going to have 2 different or 3 or 4 different groups abutting one another in terms of interest. And there was a motion from Councillor McConnell, which I supported at the December meeting. She actually moved my motion to actually defer that back to the General Manager of Transportation. So this is the item around the cycle tracks on Sherbourne and Wellesley. We're going back to the General Manager of Transportation, who's going to engage in broader, wider conversations, including members of this group, including members of the cycling community, and take a look at international best practices to see if we can come up with a resolution that's going to perhaps provide greater accommodations for everyone. So you haven't seen the end of the, you haven't heard the end of the Sherbourne-Wellesley cycle track discussion. Most likely it will be coming back. And then finally, we had the Access Equity and Human Rights Award, and the Access Award for Disabilities Issues went to a really dynamic young recipient. Her name is Mayan Ziv, and I had the honor of meeting her and presenting her with the award. She's a pretty extraordinary young leader. Some of you will probably know her from the community, and those who attended the award ceremony, I think, got to know her. But she has been living with muscular dystrophy, and she has been working on an app to map the accessibility status of different businesses and locations, which is, of course, very helpful. You don't have to, guess whether or not an establishment is accessible. What she's done is created an app, and you get to populate that app just like you do with Expedia and TripAdvisor with your reviews. So that's very, very exciting. And I think her work, from what I can tell, is just going to grow from there. So that's my report. And if there are no questions of me as the chair and my report, can I get a motion to receive? Okay, thank you very much, Wendy. All those in favor? Okay, adopted. Wonderful. Chris, we're coming back to you.
Okay. Great, thank you. Right, can everyone hear me? Great. So the project in front of us here is the Toronto Sidewalk Cafe Design Manual. It's in fact a joint initiative between Municipal Licensing and Standards and Transportation Services. I'm joined today by Hamish Goodwin, who's my colleague at Municipal Licensing and Standards. He's here today, but in fact, we're really going to concentrate primarily on the transportation component of the project, both the Sidewalk Cafe Design Manual and the pedestrian clearway components of the initiative. We've been to DIAC on 2 occasions through the project, so this is the 3rd time we've been to DIAC, so we're pleased to be here. Generally, the purpose of our presentation today, as part of an ongoing consultation effort that we're in the middle of right now, is to both update the committee on the status of the project, but also to seek input on some of the key priorities of the manual that we've identified in the presentation today. And also to try to get a sense from the committee what the next steps of the initiative should be. So just a reminder of the project, because it seems to get more complicated every time we meet. The project has 2 legislative components. One is the Sidewalk Cafe bylaw, which again is being led by MLS, and that regulates all aspects of sidewalk cafes and marketing displays, except for sidewalk design in the pedestrian clearway. The streets bylaw, which is chapter 743, ensures that pedestrian clearways for cafe and marketing activities are clear, straight, and of sufficient width to accommodate pedestrians. The manual, in fact, is an implementation tool of both of those regulations. So it includes a number of requirements for the design of cafes, which are reflected back in the bylaws. It includes also things like plans, illustrations, and pictures that necessarily a bylaw can't include just because it would become too large in its scope. We've been working on the project for quite a long time. I think we started in around 2012. We've gone through a number of rounds of consultation, and we are currently, as I mentioned, going through one right now. We expect to be in front of committee and council, not in March, as the presentation mentions, but we've pulled that back another month in order to complete our consultation processes. What we're hoping to do then is come back and then draft the required bylaws for the 2018 Sidewalk Cafe season. Okay. So just looking back over previous consultations, this isn't new material, but I just thought I'd remind members of the committee where we're starting with this initiative. So one of the things that I think really became apparent to us early in the process is what we're doing here isn't necessarily new, and it's not something that other cities in North America haven't tried to grapple with. But we've noticed that other cities, major North American cities, do and have tried to develop both sidewalk cafe design guidelines and sidewalk cafe design standards, or sidewalk design standards. And really what the other cities have attempted to do is balance both a vibrant cafe culture with accessible pedestrian-oriented sidewalks. So that's really the challenge we have in front of us, is to achieve both within the City of Toronto context. Okay. And in fact, those other North American cities, although the urban fabric and design context is often different, it's not like comparing apples to apples in all cases, many of those jurisdictions have in fact adopted higher pedestrian clearway standards in their busy downtown areas. So a few of the examples I have on the screen here are Ottawa, which has a pedestrian clearway of around 3 meters to 6.5 in their downtown area, 4.6 for San Francisco, 3.6 for Boston, around 2.44 meters for Portland. Vancouver has adopted a 2.4 meter standard, New York 2.4, and Toronto, in fact, is really at the low end of the scale at 2.1 meters. And I think when you look at today at our context within the City of Toronto, you can see where some of the issues are. And this is really what we're trying to speak to as we develop these guidelines and recommendations to City Council. So we really feel strongly as a division that we need to tackle some of the issues that I have up on the screen right now. And these all have strong accessibility and pedestrian safety impacts. The slide in front of us here show 4 examples of pedestrian clearways that are quite narrow, in some cases even less than the 1.5 meter minimum AODA standard. In many cases, we have sidewalk cafes that force pedestrians to weave around them. So in fact, what they do is prevent an obstacle to the pedestrian clearway where both able-bodied individuals, people with strollers, large groups, people with mobility and cognitive impairments are forced to move around the sidewalk cafe. And I think everyone here knows how difficult that can be, and that's something that we really feel strongly we need to tackle as part of this initiative. The next slide shows 4 images of busy sidewalks within the city. So quite apart from whether the pedestrian clearway is straight and clear, which are issues, again, the committee should know that there are a number of very busy sidewalks in the downtown area of the city. We have one example on the bottom that shows a sidewalk intersection at King and John Street, and there are quite a number of people that are both trying to get out of the inner area and commuting, walking from the downtown into their areas where they live, and they're also waiting at this corner for streetcars, so that the sidewalk in this condition, in this location, is quite congested. Okay, and then there are some other issues which are probably a little easier to tackle, but they include issues such as the encroachment of cafe elements into the pedestrian clearway, such as umbrellas, A-frame signage, umbrellas, and planters. And those are issues that we need to tackle as well. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that the City of Toronto is on the low scale in terms of the legislative requirement for pedestrian clearway width in busy downtown areas. So we have some standards in place. Having said that, most existing city policies and bylaws require a minimum of 2.1 meter pedestrian clearway for our streets and sidewalks. Most of those existing policies do require a straight and unimpeded pedestrian clearway, so they often have that kind of language built into it. And in fact, there is precedent for requiring enhanced pedestrian clearways in certain locations. So for example, on portions of Spadina between Queen and Baldwin, Dundas between Spadina and Beverly, and portions of Danforth and Yonge Street, there is a precedent for looking at those busier areas and requiring a wider clearway in those instances. When we consulted with our stakeholders earlier in the process, we conducted a multi-phased public, industry, and interdivisional consultation with over 20 stakeholders events. And in fact, the results, I think, for us were quite encouraging at the same time as pointing to some of the issues we need to deal with. So for example, there was broad support for consistent rules for the project, more design options. So we presented a number of different ways you could design cafes, and they were really well received. And there were changes that MLS recommended to the application process to make it easier. And those were all really well received by both members of the public and also by the cafe community as well. The other area that we found really strongly came out was most stakeholders expressed concern with narrow obstructed clearways through the process, especially residents and accessibility stakeholders. On the other hand, industry stakeholders felt strongly that existing cafe permit areas should remain as is. And the reasons most often cited were reasons of business viability. So those really are the two conflicting priorities that we're hearing from, that we're trying to balance through our project. It's really about the importance of the clearway versus the importance of the business on the street and what that brings to streets and sidewalks in terms of viability and vibrancy. Okay. So hearing both of those concerns, our approach is two-pronged. What we're trying to do and what we propose to do, and we're hoping to get input on today, is the concept of balancing the need to support local businesses and also to support residents and pedestrians as well. So the items on this particular slide speak to how we are proposing to support local businesses through this process. One of the things that we think is a really key in our arsenal is to create additional flexibility and design options for cafe owners. So right now our rules are pretty restrictive, and we think we can do much better than that and really try to design our way out of the issues we have in our sidewalks today. So a couple of those key things, and I'll just list them off. Additional sidewalk cafe options. So right now all you can do is frontage cafes, but we're proposing to add curbside cafes, parklet cafes, and small frontage cafes into our design mix. Another option is to use neighboring frontages to expand the cafe operations if the adjacent owner agrees. So the idea is, instead of bringing the cafe activity out into the clearway, it spreads out a little bit along the sidewalk. We are proposing to support local businesses the reduction in the clearway requirement on local streets only, down from 2.1 meter to 1.8 meter. So the concept here is that we provide wide pedestrian clearways where they're needed the most. So we're proposing that in those less busy local areas, that it gets shrunk down, but on the busy Main Street areas, in fact, we would ask for enhanced clearways. Room where room is needed. Fourth thing we're proposing is reducing some of the fencing requirements as well. So for example, our current bylaws require fencing, full stop, but we think we can be a little bit more flexible on that. So things like planters, stanchions, portable fencing can be introduced as well. Fewer restrictions on the choice of cafe furniture and elements. So we've made a conscious decision not to be the design nanny for these kinds of applications, and we certainly heard that loud and clear from several sources. What the city wants to focus on, or recommending that we focus on, are really pedestrian safety and accessibility as our core pieces. We think we can also provide some flexibility for operators to do year-round cafe operations as well. And those, I think, in combination will provide much more flexibility to cafe operators. On the MLS side, they are looking at introducing a number of processes that will hopefully make it easier for cafe operators to apply and receive cafe permits. Things like streamlined application processes, as of right approval for small frontage cafes is something we're looking at. So for example, a small frontage cafe being a few tables and chairs right out by the facade, maybe they don't need to go through a cumbersome application process because it's a fairly simple application, and maybe they don't need to be charged a cafe fee as well. These are small cafes that we think can benefit the street without creating those kinds of pedestrian clearway issues. Okay. But again, it's a balance between providing those opportunities for cafe operators and supporting residents and pedestrians. So this slide really shows some of the key items that we're proposing, or we're thinking of proposing to council that would support residents and pedestrians and members of the accessibility community. The first one of three is sidewalks of sufficient width. Sidewalks must be safe, accessible, and comfortable to users of all ages and abilities. And this, for us, is a first principle. Looking at what that really means in detail, we're proposing that a minimum pedestrian clearway of 2.1 meters for arterial and collector roads is adopted, and 1.8 meters in width for local roads. There will be instances, however, on the busier sidewalks where the general manager, transportation services, may require a greater width to safely accommodate pedestrians. Those clearway requirements would be set by staff, and it would be appealable by a cafe applicant to the general manager of transportation services. So whereas the current process allows for an appeal to be heard by community council, what our proposal is that would then be heard first by an interdivisional staff panel that would be would include groups such as urban design, transportation, and economic development, and recommendations from this panel would then go to the general manager for a final decision. The clearway requirements would also apply to not only sidewalk cafes and marketing, but it would apply to new applications and permit renewals as well. Then the final two on this slide talk to the importance of straight sidewalks and clear sidewalks as well. So again, one of the issues that we identified is where sidewalk cafes completely block the pedestrian clearway. So what we're saying here is that we don't need sidewalks that are absolutely straight, some wiggle can happen, but the concept of blocking the sidewalk is not appropriate from an accessibility standpoint, and that needs to change as part of these rules. Okay. So those are the key elements we really wanted to speak with the committee on today. I'm just going to quickly review in a few slides how the manual is organized. We're not really going to focus on that today because we've focused on that in the previous couple of meetings. But the structure of the manual really hasn't changed a lot in the last few months. It'll have a sidewalk design section, it'll have a cafe design section, and then it'll include a number of pages on specific design of elements such as fences and planters. The manual then pulls all of that together with some illustrations. So just moving through that quickly. This slide shows the number of cafe types that are now available, including curbside and parklet cafes, and some of the rules around those. It will have site design rules and recommendations, including images and plans that show how these cafe types can be organized on the sidewalk. The manual has accessibility requirements throughout it, but what we do on a couple of the pages is we try to collect them all together so that people have a really good understanding of what those requirements are. Again, we have cafe element pages which show not only the recommended and required rules of each element, but show images of what those opportunities are, whether they're plastic chairs, wood chairs, inexpensive chairs, really expensive chairs. We're showing a range of these opportunities. And then the pulling it all together section looks at prototype sidewalks, a narrow type, an average type like Danforth, and a wide type such as some portions of College. And it looks at how all of the different cafe types can be used on those cross sections. Okay. The presentation does not include a section on transition, but I wanted to speak with you briefly about that today because it's really important, and it's one of the key things that MLS and transportation are looking at right now. So our proposed transition for the pedestrian clearway rules would be 2 years for cafes on arterial and collector roads and 3 years on local roads where there aren't as many issues today. And so the question has come up about how we're dealing with that. So we think that the city can help with the transition period because there are a lot of cafes that aren't currently in compliance with the new clearway regulations, and we need to help them get into compliance because it's not easy. One of the things we're proposing is that transportation services work one-on-one with the operators to help them bring those cafes into compliance with the new regulations. And one-on-one really means that this is a bit of a design problem, and we're hoping to design our way out of this. For example, a cafe that may not be compliant using the frontage cafe type may be compliant using a curbside cafe type or another design tool. So we're hopeful that we can, in a sense, design our way out of most of the issues that are currently out there. We are also proposing that transportation services pay for professional design resources to help both cafe operators go through that process and also BIAs go through a block planning process where maybe all of these cafes can be designed in sequence so the sidewalk is better organized for all parties concerned. We also would like to with support from BIAs, develop a number of pilot projects. So some of the obvious ones would be to do parklet projects with BIAs, such as the ones that are currently being installed on Elm Street. And perhaps we could team up with areas like College Street where curbside cafes really would make a lot of sense. And it may be a great way to promote the project and take some lessons out of those initiatives. And finally, we also think that both parties have roles to play, both the operators and the cities. So we feel that there's an opportunity for operators to change their cafe configurations so that they work better with the sidewalk. But by the same token, the city has a role to play as well. So we can't expect design or cafe operators to make those kinds of changes without us looking at our street furniture out there and trying to adjust the street furniture and the barriers that we're putting up in response to those issues. So it really needs to be a collaborative effort on the parts of both the city and also the operators. So just wrapping up, again, this slide's now outdated. We're reporting to PWIC for my information for the April council cycle, and municipal licensing and standards will report on their bylaw through licensing and standards. Both of those will then meet up at City Council. Looking forward, one of the key initiatives that we need to work on is the concept of pedestrian priority mapping. So where we've identified that more width is needed, what we are starting to do is develop a database methodology to determine, well, how much is needed if we decide that we need more. So that's something that we'll start to work on very intensively in the summer, and we're expecting to report out to City Council through DIAC as well on the results of that consultation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I suspect we will have questions for you. Members, hands up if I can ask you to raise them so I can take note on who's interested in asking questions. So I see Stephanie, Yin, Tom, and Joe. Stephanie, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Just on the point of working with the BIAs for around multiple cafes on the same block, will there be regulations around that? Because working with the BIAs is a great idea, but I'm just wondering if there's something that can enforce that if certain cafe owners decide they don't want to go along with a unified block setup.
Yes, and that's quite a difficult process. So, you know, when I live on the Danforth, around the Pape area, and I think we see, for example, the opportunity of trying to disentangle these areas and move to a curbside condition, and we think it would solve a lot of the problems out there. It almost represents a win-win, but I think you're right. Like everyone would need to move in sequence. And so what we need to do is explore how we can have everyone do that. One that doesn't, I think the scheme would have some issues. So, for example, one of the things we could do is look at blocks or part of blocks if there's resistance in certain areas to a wholesale move to one cafe type. But at the end of the day, what we're thinking is if the general manager has the final decision on that, and we go through a consultation process that includes the councillors' offices and the BIAs, that we should be able to make those kinds of decisions in the end, provided that they're fully informed and consulted on.
No more questions? Yin, to ask questions.
Hi. I really appreciate the long years of work, and I've participated in some of them before. I wondered this, did you call it this booklet? It's for not only business owners, but the general public. And if so, the public pedestrians who are concerned about violations, or can there be inclusion of what to do when there's violations of these, you know, so that we're not just saying, you know, go ahead and be flexible, but there is a enforcement measure, or, you know, if pedestrians or people such as myself saying this is totally in violation, even according to the new guidelines. So is there something like that in that booklet, or can there be? Can that, call this number, you know, that type of thing.
Yeah, so the manual itself, being an implementation tool of the bylaw, won't speak to that. It would be the bylaws themselves that would need to speak to enforcement of any of the permits that have been granted. Hamish, did you want to add maybe something about how the MLS bylaw would manage enforcement?
Yeah, sure. So the actual bylaw doesn't need to outline the specific enforcement measures. Enforcement is undertaken mostly on a complaints basis, so the phone number is simply to call 311 as the current process is for any obstructions in the sidewalk from cafes or A-frames or the ramps into the buildings that block the sidewalk, those sorts of things. Call 311 and the call or the complaint is directed to the appropriate division for follow-up.
But again, I do hear your concerns, and we've heard this throughout the consultation process, that with more permissive or more broad tools and regulations is a requirement, I think, to make sure that all of the cafe operators and different players have their part and continue to meet those rules. So there is that risk, I would agree, in developing this kind of regulation.
Yin, do you have any other questions? Okay, hang on to those comments. You're going to get a chance to offer them. And just a reminder for the members who might be thinking about moving a motion or perhaps giving written advice, please consult with the clerk and they will help you prepare that. Tom, to ask questions.
Thank you. My question has to do with, does the sidewalk cafe manual or the whole design also includes other commercial interests on the streets, such as grocery stores that spill out on the sidewalk? Is that included in that?
Not expressly, no. So both of the bylaws, and apologize for the confusion on this, both of the bylaws regulate sidewalk cafes and marketing displays. The manual itself, though, has only been geared towards sidewalk cafes. It would have been too much additional material to include in. Having said that, the manual itself, most of the regulations apply to marketing displays as well. So the same good design principles in the manual would be good design principles for a flower display or a grocery store display.
It would be good, I guess, on a volunteer basis, but there must be some regulations around other commercial ventures on the street. I'm specifically talking about, I live near Bloor West, sort of between Jane and Runnymede. And on the north sidewalk, there's a number of grocery stores that display their fruits and vegetables outside. And problem with a commercial venture like that is that people actually shop from those installations. So you have, even if you have 2 meters or 2.5 meters of sidewalk outside of the displays, people will congregate around the displays and shop from there, therefore leaving only maybe a meter or less for people who want to cross the street. The other issue that I have in these instances, and it would also apply to cafes, is how do you count the sidewalk? How do you measure the sidewalk? Specifically in this case, what's happening is that there are trees planted closer to the road, to the curb, and around the trees, the sidewalk is missing for about 3 feet, maybe 4 feet square, and it's dirt. So if you're including that in the sidewalk and someone comes across in a wheelchair or with a walker, that creates a huge obstacle. And given that, plus people walking, other people walking, sometimes it's really difficult to get around.
So to the first question, which is about the grocery store displays, they're considered a subcomponent of marketing displays. So the same pedestrian clearway rules that apply to cafes would also apply to marketing displays. Hamish, anything more to add about that? I don't want to get too much into your bylaw piece. Okay. The second question was, how do we define the pedestrian clearway? So I think it's a little bit of an inside-out approach. So if you have a sidewalk, the first thing to do is to figure out what you need for the pedestrian clearway. straight, clear, and of an appropriate width. The furnishing and planting zone, which is the part by the sidewalk and includes street furniture, bike rings, and tree pits, is a little bit of a judgment call on any particular site. It needs to be wide enough to collect all of those elements, and that can vary, as you know, sidewalk by sidewalk. It could be as little as 0.8 meters, but with the open tree pits, it could be as wide as 1.5. So in determining what you need for the pedestrian clearway, you've got to make sure that all of those encumbrances are outside of that zone. And I think, to your point, it's not always easy. So I'm not sure if that's answered your question fully.
Well, I mean, you addressed it, but you didn't answer it. I mean, the problems are still there.
Yeah.
And I don't see them being dealt in this manual at all. Especially when you're talking about the fact that the clearways, clear sidewalk in Toronto is less than any of the other major cities that you showed. And now you're proposing that in some cases it will be even less than that. I can't see how anyone in a wheelchair or a scooter will be able to get through.
Yeah. So again, the approach that we're taking is to provide the additional width where it's needed. So on a main street, for example, like a Bloor West, the minimum would be 2.1, and depending on the number of pedestrians on that street, it could be wider than that. So we're not proposing on a main street like Bloor West that it would go down to 1.8. What we're proposing are the minimums, and to try it to the extent possible to reduce or remove those kinds of obstacles on the sidewalk through redesigning those elements and the cafes on the streets.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. Joe to ask questions, and then Monica.
I guess I have comments and questions. The question then,
Save your comments until the end. You'll get to make those comments. Questions right now.
fair enough.
Thank you.
The thing that gets created on Elm Street each year in the summer is, what is that referred to as? Is that a parklet or curbside cafe or
Sorry, which part again? Can you?
on Elm Street?
Elm Street would be parklets. So parklets are basically an extension of the sidewalk into a permanent parking space.
Right, okay,
Yeah,
that's a parklet.
those are called parklets. Yeah. There are
Am I-
there are two types of parklets that are being proposed. One is a public parklet like San Francisco has, which is free to be used by all members of the public. And then there is a parklet cafe, which is licensed by the adjacent restaurant or business owner and is for their use and their patrons' use.
Which one is the one on Elm Street?
Elm Streets are public, and there have been other ones like it recently. One was piloted on Church Street that was public, and John Street had some parklets a couple of years ago which were public as well.
They seem to be well enjoyed by the public. I kind of like those. The other thing is, as you were giving the presentation, you were talking about the cafe application panel. I'm kind of creating my own words. I didn't quite catch how you described it. And the city design team. And I'm wondering if you had a person with a mobility challenge or whatever on your committee that also provides input into what these designs look like, or when a decision has to be made on an application. Do you have someone, with a mobility challenge or as part of that deliberation?
Yeah. Yep. So potentially, yes. We haven't. It's an idea right now. It's not yet even a recommendation to council. But if we did proceed with the concept of a committee for the appeals or a panel, it would certainly be a possibility.
Thank you very much, Joe. Monica?
I was wondering if there are any rules and which bylaws it is about lineups. I too live near the Danforth. Ice cream is a huge thing in the middle of summer, and the lineups coming out of the gelato place can be pretty filling of the entire sidewalk area. And anytime the Danforth Music Hall has a free-for-all, watching the kids line up down Broadview, like what are the rules, who controls that? Who makes sure that there's accessibility through all of that?
Right, so, good comment. The proposals so far don't explicitly deal with lineups, so we'll take your point back. I think potentially where some of this is addressed is on a site-by-site basis. So the rules always need to be applied contextually, which is really what we're trying to get at here. So in the case of the Danforth Music Hall, I know the area, it's a tough one. I think what you'd have to look at is both the cafe with the red wrought iron fencing, and can that be pulled back? Can it be moved into the furnishing and planting zone? Can the planters be dealt with? Those things all need to be dealt with at that kind of local level.
Thank you very much, Monica. Anyone else to ask questions? Don't be shy. Okay. Then I have a few questions for you, Chris. In the manual, in the presentation, you mentioned that this will apply to permit renewals.
Yes.
Is this manual or the requirements for minimum sidewalk width being applied retroactively? Because I heard what the stakeholders said, which is like, leave everything as is. We like the patio sizes that we have now, but considering that you're trying to achieve 2.1 minimum requirements and 1.8 on collectors, what happens when you don't have that? Are you applying this manual and the regulations retroactively?
Our current proposal is that they're applied to existing permit holders. Having said that, we're in a process right now of ground truthing that, and that's part of why we're here, and it's part of why we're currently speaking with the Restaurant Association, Tabia, and other stakeholders as well. What we need to understand first is the kind of impacts it will have to cafe owners and operators. So what we're trying to do right now is develop a series of design studies in the really, really hard areas of the city to try to figure out what those impacts are. So if we are asking for existing permit holders to comply with the new regulations, that we understand whether we can solve some of those problems. Because our intent isn't to gut or savage the cafe culture out there as well. We want to be respectful of that.
So while you give consideration to the license permitted holders, and it sounds like you're giving a lot of consideration to that particular group of stakeholders, how will you balance that against this particular group of stakeholders, which are those who are living with disabilities? Are you giving the same amount of careful consideration and design to this other group, or simply trying to design a solution for the patio owners?
I think what we're going to do is try to acknowledge both concerns. I can't tell you right now, Councillor, whether we're prioritizing one over the other. Again, I think the response to that is somewhat situation-based. So for example, on Bay Street, where we have these surges of pedestrians, that's probably an area where we might want to prioritize working with the different stakeholders, pedestrian movement, whereas in some areas where there's fewer pedestrians or a predominance of cafes, that mix may change. But I think what I'm hearing is that we need to find a way to make sure both concerns are met.
So let me just ask this question again.
Yeah.
Maybe you can answer succinctly.
Yeah.
Does this mean that existing patios might shrink to meet the requirement?
They may be reconfigured, or they may be kept in the same location. Again, that's site-specific.
Okay. And when you said during your presentation that the regulations are not new, what did you mean by that? And if they aren't new, then why wasn't there a manual earlier?
Currently, we have a number of different regulations that govern sidewalk cafes. We have predominantly the one that we've been referencing is Chapter 313, which is the old City of Toronto bylaw. In addition to that, we have a version of this manual that was developed in 1989, so it's really quite out of date. In terms of the regulations we're referencing, I think what I might have mentioned in the presentation is most of the recent bylaws and policy guidance uses 2.1 as the minimum standard.
So by the fact that the 2.1 minimum standard already exists, you're simply saying that you want to make sure it's further codified so it's consistent across the city? Is that why it's not new?
Yeah, we expect it to be further codified, but we also want to make sure it's properly explained. So right now, sometimes bylaws, even though they use the word straight and clear, inappropriately measure it from the curb edge, which is, you don't want people with wheelchairs right at the curb edge. So part of our goal is to better clarify what it is and the kind of standards we're applying.
Okay. And you talked about the method of pedestrian prioritization. I don't believe transportation currently collects pedestrian counts now, unless I'm wrong. How are you going to create this new method of pedestrian prioritization if you don't currently collect pedestrian counts?
So we do collect pedestrian counts. We tend to collect it at intersections, and we do 8-hour counts.
But intersections doesn't necessarily measure travel pattern of pedestrians on sidewalks and roads.
You're right. So what we're doing is we're taking that information, and in some cases we're adding mid-block counts. So we've started to add that data into the mix. And in addition to that, what we're proposing to do is layer other data into the tool that we're developing. So it could, for example, be data on the major surface transit routes, the boarding and alighting information that TTC uses, and other pieces. So in layering all of this information, it allows us to determine which sidewalks pedestrians use and where the movement is occurring, east, west, north, south.
Okay. And then I have two other questions, and I just want to get it in rather than do a second round of questions. So with the indulgence of the committee, I'm just going to ask these two questions. Did transportation staff factor in winter conditions when they were creating the minimum sidewalk widths? So, for example, in the winter, we've got piles of snow, some on severe winters. Did you factor that in? If the snow piling up is not removed on sidewalks, the minimum requirement of 2.1 meters may be reduced to 1.5, depending on how much snow there is.
Do you mean for the existing bylaw or the proposals?
What I'm asking is, did you and the team consider winter conditions when you came up with the 2.1 minimum sidewalk clearance?
Yes, it assumes that it's cleared of snow.
Okay. And then finally, with respect to allowing design flexibility, including not requiring the patio permit holders to have fencing, how do you ensure that the furniture, the tables and chairs that patrons will be using, that they don't move them at free will to then create an additional impediment? Because, for example, if there's a dinner of a gathering of friends, it's 4 people, another 4 group of friends see them, and they decide to cluster together, move tables and chairs as we've all done inside a restaurant. The floor space of inside a restaurant completely changes when that happens. But how do you ensure that you don't exceed the 2.1 minimum requirement on the sidewalk?
Yes. So where we've seen most of these applications done successfully are in areas where there are slightly lower pedestrian volumes and on streets that have the wider sidewalks. So for example, if you look in Chicago, they have some districts where they've used this type quite effectively. When they are applied to sidewalks with more pedestrians on them, then the use of no fencing is probably not the best response. So I've got an illustration back up on the screen that shows how we would approach the problem on a busier sidewalk like a Danforth or a College. So one wouldn't necessarily have no fencing. What one is really doing is removing a bit of fencing, but making sure that there's enough enclosure left that someone with a cane can landmark around that object or that enclosure and get past it. So it would still have some objects in there where people could landmark and that patrons would know that there is some edge between the sidewalk and the cafe itself. Will it be proof against people drifting or shifting? I'm not sure it'll be entire proof of that. So I would recognize that as an issue with this cafe type.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Moving to comments then. I know, I'm going to start from this side of the room. Joe, then Monica, and Rahima, did I see your hand go up? Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Joe, you go first.
Well, my first comment is exactly what the councillor raised, is that if you remove fences, permanent fencing from the cafe areas, that's exactly what's going to happen. There is going to be encroachment. People will move their tables and chairs, people will take their bags and whatever they have, and that's going to move out into the 2.1 clear area. And we're all familiar with the busy places in the city where cafes compete with sidewalks, pedestrian clearway, and removing the permanent fences, I think, would be a disaster for that clear space. What's the other comment?
Okay, thank you.
That would.
Thank you very much, Joe. Monica?
A couple of comments. One actually to Tom. The page before that slide shows that the 2.1 is separate from where the trees and all that stuff is. If you have the slide deck, because you were asking about the difference between 2.1 and everything that's on the edge. Technically, that's supposed to be separate. Can you go to the slide before this one? Nope, after them, I guess. No, just before. That one, yeah. Because I didn't feel it was being answered properly, so I just thought I'd point that out. My
Thank you,
other
Monica.
comment is, I was a little put back by your comment of a possibility of a person with a disability being on any sort of committee determining either the actual license or any appeals. I really think that needs to be rethought and perhaps repurposed in your head, that it's not a possibility. There should always be someone, whether they're combined with, let's say, the representative of the BIA is a person who happens to have a disability as well. Awesome. But I really think that that should be not a possibility, but something that needs to be there, because it's a major component of the AODA and of the city bylaws that we need that accessible space. And it would save you guys a lot of time and energy if you have someone there who can say, whoa, you're not thinking of this, than to do it and then go, oh crap, now we got to spend millions of dollars and change it again. Just saying.
Fair enough.
Okay, great. Our next speaker is Rahima.
This is about my experience. At a major intersection, there was a sidewalk cafe. My wheelchair is narrow, but it's long. I was informed there that I should have been using the other sidewalks. So I decided to take some friends and chairs, walkers, and one with a cane, a white cane. And I asked for a table. They said they couldn't accommodate us. The sidewalk between the tables and the shrubs, my chair would fit, but scooters and other chairs could not. And the person with the cane had difficulty maneuvering around the furniture and the shrubs. Thank you.
Terry Lynn.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I guess I'm concerned about several things in this report. Specifically, there's some different measurements that have been mentioned, the 2.1 and the 1.8. And I know of all the spots of the images that you've shown. I've been to all of those spots. And the city of Toronto, in terms of population, it's getting bigger, not smaller. And I'm just wondering again, not wondering, I know that making those requirements smaller are going to make things more complicated and more complex for pedestrians, particularly persons with disabilities that are trying to use the sidewalks and things. So I would strongly encourage you to think about the ramifications of that, and that the AODA Act is into force at the moment, and that all of those requirements are coming down the pipeline, and this report doesn't reflect that. In particular, I can't find the spot, but in particular, I saw a couple of times in the report where it said, will be AODA compliant or will be accessible, and that's like a broad sweeping statement. There's not a lot of specifics that are tied to that at all. I do think all of those things need to be looked at. And also I'm concerned that individual users that are having trouble wayfinding and using the street have to call 311. In a related comment, but not exactly the same, 3 months ago, there was a construction site set up quite close to my house, and 2 people were hit within the period of 2 days that I saw. And I had called the first time a person was hit, and it had to do with, I guess the construction site had thought that they had reconfigured the road properly. The first time the pedestrian was hit, it was a cyclist, and there was actually a police officer there. I ended up calling 311, 911, all of these services were busy. I had to call the city councilor to get the issue addressed. And it was from where I sat, from where a lot of people sat, it was, you were looking into the face of a direct safety hazard. It was very clear that there was no safe way for people to move. That's why those accidents happened. And from a pedestrian point of view, I'm not myself blind, but my dad was blind for a 2-year period due to an accident. And I've lived with a lot of blind folks. And what happens with the image that was presented before, where there is no fencing. So I'll just try to explain the image a little bit better. The image shows pillars or planters, and there's a huge gap in between where I guess a fence would be. And so in this walking situation, whether or not you're using a seeing eye dog or a cane user, what would happen is someone would approach that planter, approach that pillar, hit it with their cane, or the dog would walk around it. And then because there are pedestrians in between those spaces, they're now potentially getting pushed into that situation again, where they're going to hit the next pillar or the next planter. That, I see that happen all the time. The thing is, it's preventable, right? And it does put particularly people that are not sighted in a precarious situation, because the way out isn't going to be readily apparent, right? And I say that, again, I'm not blind, I'm saying that with a particular privilege, but just as an example, in terms of how complex it can be, I want to echo what Kristen Wong-Tam said and what Monica Winkler said, that it's imperative to have individuals with disabilities wayfind in these circumstances. Not only will that hurt the disability community, but I mean, your project or the project that you're proposing is going to be in great jeopardy. And I worry about the work that has to be done by individual users of streets and travel and things if everyone has to call like 311 to get that remedied. From this report, it does seem, I mean, I'll be honest, like you're privileging businesses in this scenario, and I'm not anti-business by any means. I don't think it has to be that way. But I do think there needs to be clear guidelines where exceptionality isn't commonplace, right? Like, because I think once you look at exceptions, you're just making a lot of work for individual pedestrians, but also like people that are working on the projects.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry Lynn. Yin to speak, and then Tom.
Thanks. I just want to reiterate, the 1.8 really concerns me. How whatever is designated as local streets can morph into, a more populated area. So I don't know. But I just, because Toronto already has the lowest, the narrowest street, why go further narrow? I mean, New York being, they're doing well business-wise. They have wider streets. So I personally think that going narrower and narrower for whatever reason is going down the wrong, a difficult path for people who use the streets, pedestrians. I want to reiterate that things like snow piles, bicycle racks, all these street furniture further narrow the street. I know, you have clearly put it out there that, these obstructions are not considered to be part of the 2.1, but life happens, people park their bikes, people do this, put this A-frame out, so the wider streets are always better. So and one last point to echo again, we need something to mark clearly the cafe part and the pedestrian part. If it's something that's detectable by a cane on the ground, that's great. If it's something that's like like the City Hall, just outside of here, there's those bank ribbons, I don't know what you call it. Anyways, just coming today, I hit them and I realized, okay, don't go there, just follow the ribbon. There's got to be something, it's even if it's, a cafe putting out a table and 2 chairs, I just don't trust that. I mean, people get mad at me, I get mad at them, and we get into a fight. So, also, more and more people with disabilities are traveling both ways. I'm going one way, another blind person, wheelchair users coming the other way. So it's not just, so I think just that there's lots of reasons for maintaining 2.1 clearance, and I would really appreciate it if you speak on our behalf when you get pushback from the businesses.
Great. Thank you, Yin.
Thank you very much, Yin. Tom?
Thanks. My comment has to do with garbage that's generated by commercial enterprises. I've been on, for example, in Kensington Market. The sidewalks are relatively narrow. The proprietor put up one of those tent-looking signs on a sidewalk. The sign was the sign was about 1.5 feet wide, so it took up that much room from the sidewalk. And in the evening, the restaurant put out their garbage on the sidewalk as well. There was absolutely no way I could get across. The only way I could move down the street was to jump off the curb, go down into the traffic, go with the traffic, and then come back again. It was just impossible.
Yeah, so neither of the bylaws deal with those issues, the issues of garbage collection or of A-frame signs. So that's outside of the scope of our project. I appreciate it's an issue, but those are not areas that we can advance through this project.
Really? I would have expected that one project would deal with all outcomes of commercial ventures on a street that impact sidewalks and public spaces.
Well, it doesn't. We deal with cafes specifically, what we're trying to do is harmonize the cafe bylaws. So the bylaws that deal with those are completely separate, and we don't actually have a mandate to revisit those at this point. I'm not suggesting this isn't an issue. I hear you, but I don't have the ability to deal with those as part of this project.
I appreciate it. I guess that's why some people get really frustrated with government.
Thank you very much, Tom. Joe to speak?
Well, a couple of points then. I mean, how do we make that part of the overall use of the sidewalk and the cafe and this commercial venture? Because that exact problem is in my own neighborhood as well, including trees inside the 2.1 measurement or the 1.1 measurement area. On Edward, there's that problem, but there's also the garbage. I mean, if your sidewalk is of limited space and the commercial venture wants a cafe, and you know part of their business is to put that garbage out there, because that is something that we face all the time, then why isn't that part of the consideration of putting the cafe there, knowing that certain times of the day it's going to be not passable? I mean, that should have some bearing on allowing how far that cafe can stick out into the clear area or defines the clear area. So if that's not part of the consideration, how do we make that part of the consideration?
So I think, I hear what you're saying. I think there are two things here. One, I think what I was getting at with my comments is the enforcement of that is beyond what I can do here. But I think to your point, the consideration of how garbage collection or street activities happen is definitely within our remit. So for example, if a curbside cafe is considered, how that operator deals with their garbage needs to be factored into it. So, thank you. To your point about A-frame signs, we can't govern where they go because it's a different bylaw, but enforcement of that can be dealt with.
Great. Anyone else? Sorry, Joe, have you concluded your comments? Anyone else who'd like to speak? Wendy?
Thank you. It's been a really interesting discussion. I've learned a lot of things today. But one of the things, this last point that both Joe and Tom have made about the cumulative effect of various activities that business have on areas where they may have a cafe, I think is one that needs to be underscored. That it sounds almost like nobody ultimately takes responsibility for whether there is space there for people to be able to traverse. And I wonder if that, I mean, Kristen, I'm sort of looking at you too. Is there some clarity around this? Because if what we're saying is that this bylaw really, and I understand how bylaws work too, but this bylaw really is only about the cafe space, right? There are other bylaws that deal with where the garbage goes, and there are other bylaws that deal, or I think, is there a bylaw that deals with where the signs are allowed to go?
Yep.
So there's a third bylaw here, but there's a cumulative problem in that they don't seem to be speaking to each other. So, and ultimately, you know, the consequence is that we end up, and we have a room full of people here who could tell you, and I know that you've heard already, with serious difficulties trying to just get through a public space. I'm not sure how this gets addressed, but is there a way of flagging this or highlighting this? This has to be a priority, because if you can't get down the sidewalk, you can't live. You can't get out. You can't be a part of your community. So I understand the fragmentation of various sets of bylaws, you know, whether you do take that into account or don't. I think Joe's suggestion around at least understanding how they impact the design specifications that you're suggesting here needs to be seriously considered. But also, ultimately, where does somebody go then? You know, 311 doesn't seem satisfactory either. And if there's no consideration of how all of these things work together to potentially really seriously impede transportation, people getting around the city of Toronto, that's a big question. And I think it's something that needs to be addressed.
All right. Any other questions? I won't be answering your question. I will comment on it through my own comments. Anyone else who would like to speak? Opportunity to provide Chris some feedback before he goes back to his team. No? Okay. Then I will take a moment to move a motion and as well as to speak. So my motion is that we request the Public Works Infrastructure Committee to direct the General Manager of Transportation to update the draft sidewalk cafe design manual to incorporate DAAC's feedback to increase standards for pedestrian clearways to ensure that pedestrians of all abilities can safely navigate Toronto's sidewalks. The second part of the motion will be to request that you come back to this committee and provide us with those improved standards at our meeting of May 19, 2017. Chris, thank you very much, and thank you to your entire team for your work on this particular manual. I think that what I've heard so far, even through the media and the fact that, the fees are going up, and I recognize that's not what's before us today, but what was probably the most telling slide when you first began your presentation was a slide around the project scan. And Yin, my apologies, the project scan slide is just taking a look at what the other jurisdictions are doing. Can you put that on the screen just temporarily? And so we were taking a look at, where are we in Toronto versus where are they in Ottawa, San Francisco, Boston, and Chicago, and so forth. And you can tell that Toronto, being the most populous and densely populated city in Canada, and one of the ones in North America now, seems to have the poorest and the weakest sidewalk width requirement. What committee members here are saying to you is, given what we are seeing through your project environmental scan, it seems almost like we could probably do a little bit better. I think any movement to reduce the pedestrian clearway from 2.1, which is already, I think by all standards, very minimum and perhaps inadequate in terms of a sidewalk width, especially for a city this busy, reducing that to even 1.8 on Collectors Road and deferring that to the general managers of transportation's sort of discretion to approve is not satisfactory, especially not for this particular committee. So our group, I would say that our recommendation, or my recommendation of this committee, is to ask you to go back and do some further work. And I think you've heard enough in terms of lived experience and observations of the committee members that they know that you could probably do better. And we know that there will be significant pushback, especially for business owners who see it as their right because they were issued a permit, or perhaps those permits have been lost throughout the years. I know that happens every now and then. You don't know where permissions were granted. Business owners may have transferred the ownership of a business from one to another, and that patio has been in existence for 10 or 15 years, and they think it's as of right. But as the city continues to grow and as we have an aging population, I think that we need to do a lot better. If we don't factor in the other street obstructions that will pop up on a weekly basis and seasonal basis, I think we're doing this manual a disservice, especially as it pertains to this particular community. So not factoring in how snow and ice is accumulated, what type of obstructions there may be, even if it's temporary obstructions such as A-frames, which never seem to be temporary, they seem to be permanent, even though by bylaw, they're not permitted to be there. They tend to stick around, and 311, from my experience, does not give us active and effective enforcement. The other thing is that as we have populations that are aging and we travel in pairs and groups and families, I agree with you, Yin. We do see people not walking in single file down the sidewalk. We walk in social gatherings as couples and families and people walking with strollers. You cannot have two individuals pass each other comfortably holding grocery bags or pushing a stroller when the minimum clearway is only 2.1. Factor in the snow, factor in people standing in front of a marketplace that are, that's lingering about, or any group of individual that's gathered out of an entranceway as they're leaving a concert. It makes conditions very difficult to travel. I'm able-bodied, I can jump onto the sidewalk as long as there's no oncoming vehicular traffic and maneuver around the obstacle, but for a large number of people, that's not an option. And I would say that, in some ways, we see these ramps that have populated through the city, and they're supposed to be temporary, and they've somehow become permanent obstructions on the sidewalk as well. So there are a number of conditions that currently exist that need to be factored in, and as you go through your own review of what would be AODA compliant, I think this committee has at every single time said it should not just meet the minimum requirements. The minimum requirements is for all of Ontario. We know that there are some places there they have a population of 10,000 people. We have a population of 2.9 almost, and if we factor in those surrounding the area of Toronto who come into the city to work, we know that that population easily quadruples during the business hours. So that's what I'd like for you and your team to consider as you, and hopefully you'll be able to do that. And hopefully PWIC will be able to adopt this recommendation, knowing that you've already extended your consultation by a week, or by 1 month, I think, and this manual will not now be in effect until 2008. I don't see any reason why we need to rush it. Okay, thank you. Councillor Davis, welcome to the committee, your first time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Now, we're just on item number DI 13.3. I know you've missed a presentation, some of the question period. Would you like to provide comments? Anything you want to speak to?
Having not had the benefit of hearing from the members here, I'll catch up with you after the meeting.
Great. Well, welcome to the committee.
I would concur, though, that our streets are often obstructed by many, many things that need to be taken into consideration, from A-frame signs to tree planters, and all of this, I think, needs to be looked at quite carefully as to whether the 2.13 is adequate.
Thank you, Councillor. So with that, if there's no other speakers, no other motions, all those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand or indicate your support, and that is adopted and passed. And with that, I need a motion to also receive the presentation. Monica, thank you very much. And those in favor, indicate your support. Thank you very much. That is adopted. Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. Much appreciated. Okay, so our next item is DI 13.5, the update on the city's multi-year accessibility plan, and we get to hear from our very own Nicole Cormier.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you about this exciting topic today. I'm going to preface it by the fact that it's a pretty complex topic, and you may find that you think of things afterwards that you didn't think of while we're meeting today, so I'm very glad to get your feedback afterwards as well. So what we've got on the screen right now is my first slide. It's a quick overview of the AODA standards. I know some of us work with them on a frequent basis, others maybe not so frequently. So what we're doing is a recap here of the AODA, the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, which has several parts. The original legislation that the city would have started implementing was the Accessible Customer Service Standard. And that was back in 2007, and it was recently amended, so it's now part of the Integrated Accessibility Standards. And other standards are expected for the future. I know, for example, some of the work has been already started to get feedback on like a market scan on what's needed for healthcare standards. So there are divisions in the city that were consulted on that, actually. At the bottom, so you've got the general requirements, the information and communication standards, the employment standards, transportation standards, the design of public spaces standards that were enacted in January 2013 that came into full effect recently, and the customer service standards that were amended in the summer of 2016. And we're working on integrating the requirements and the changes that have been made from that. Also, the related accessibility legislation. So the Ontario Building Code, while not part of the AODA exactly, it was originally part of a draft standard called the Accessible Built Environment Standards. And what happened with that was that the requirements that already existed in some way under the Ontario Building Code were updated, and that Ontario Building Code had an amendment in December 2013. So Section 3.8 are the barrier-free requirements. So those were updated to include recommendations that started originally from the AODA, which is also, the Americans with Disabilities Act was largely used to inform that as well. And then the elements that didn't fit in the Ontario Building Code became the design of public spaces. So those both came forward separately, but around the same time. Then at the city, you've seen, some of you might be familiar with this slide as I've used it in other presentations. And this is the slide on the Toronto Public Service Accessibility Framework. And at the top of that slide, you have the Toronto City Council's Statement of Commitment to Building an Accessible City. We have a corporate accessibility policy that's being drafted, and the reason for developing that corporate accessibility policy was because previously the city had a lot of policies in different places. For example, they had taken a decentralized approach. So originally when the AODA came out, there was an accessible customer service standard in every division. Makes it very hard and complex to try and update a policy in every division, which is one reason that the corporate accessibility policy will capture some of those changes that are necessary. And it'll also make it easier to manage, and it'll make it easier to educate people, because right now everybody seems to know their one section, but maybe not understanding holistically how they fit together. We're in the process of updating the city's multi-year accessibility plan, and that's the third category on how we manage accessibility through the city and our long-term goals. So that multi-year accessibility plan, as the AODA states, has to be our strategy of how we're going to identify barriers and plan for their prevention and plan for their removal. And also leading below that would be guidelines. So we have had many guidelines. For example, the Toronto Accessibility Design Guidelines has been in place since 2004 and is currently being updated. We have Complete Streets Guidelines that were recently updated. Taxi bylaws, we have ferry guidelines, there are employment and accommodation policies and guidelines, accessible information communication guidelines, purchasing guidelines, and customer service guidelines in each division. So as we're going through, once we have this policy implemented and the multi-year plan, which is the first priority order of business, we need to update some of these guidelines exist, or say all of the guidelines that you see do exist in different methods or formats on the intranet, but we want to update them so that they are more comprehensive, that they provide people with the specifications they should be following in order to achieve accessible results. But we also want to make those guidelines updated so that there'll be something that we can append to send to vendors, so that vendors know before working with us what our expectations are, and that we can include those things contractually as well, so that when we do accessible procurement, they know the standard that will be expected to deliver. So as I mentioned, the multi-year accessibility plan, our current plan is online, and it spanned the period from 2012 to 2016. And the focus of the plan, of the 2012 to 2016 plan, was primarily AODA compliance. So it dealt with a lot of the standards that were coming into enforcement through that period of time, meeting the deadlines, making sure that we were able to do things like provide accessible information and communication upon request. Our focus for the updated plan is to go more than the 5-year minimum, because we only have about 8 years left to get to 2025, and we don't want to get to the end of 5 years and have 3 years left to wonder how we're going to get it all done. So we're asking people, as we're going through this plan, to look at the long term, and we will go through an update at the 4-year mid-mark period. And our focus is going beyond basic compliance now. So we need to integrate accessibility into all city operations. We need to do more strategic work to identify, prevent, and remove barriers. And the goal that we're aligning with is the province's goal to be accessible by 2025. I think it's important to recognize that while we're developing a plan, the plan is a strategy, and without identifying all the things that are still barriers, what we're going to end up with at the other side of this is a very long list of things that we don't currently have the budget for or the staff plans for, and those are things that we will have to plan for each year. But we first have to identify the work that's ahead of us. And so as we go through this process, we'll be asking people to withhold their assumptions about how much it's going to cost and instead focus on the barriers first. These are the budgetary things or things that we will have to plan for on an annual basis as we go through our budgeting processes. So our approach to updating the multi-year accessibility plan is Government 2.0, which represents things like transparency, public engagement, and accountability. So we're making sure that we're looking at this by consulting with divisional stakeholders, the Disability Access and Inclusion Advisory Committee, and the public and people with disabilities will be holding in-person consultation meetings in 4 quadrants of the city, and also conducting online surveys to collect feedback from people, and listening to things like what we're talking about today. Thinking about things like garbage collection and street issues like snow pileup. These are things that we want to include as the barriers and what kind of improvements we can do to change those over the coming years. Part of the plan will also be to review and report on our 2016 accomplishments, and also to look at any ongoing work that carries over from our current plan that needs to go moving into the 2017 onward plan. We'll be reviewing progress that's made in each division to identify barriers and plan for the removal and prevention. We need to collect and incorporate input from external stakeholders, and as I mentioned, the plan is what we need to accomplish if we're going to be accessible by 2025. So I've got a couple of slides on the consultation topics. As mentioned, some of the consultation topics will be looking at what has been accomplished from 2012 to 2016. We also want to discuss any proactive measures that are already underway to prevent and remove barriers. And many times when I'm working with divisions, I find out that there's things that are taking place that are very exciting that haven't been documented in an updated plan, so the public doesn't know. So that's part of the idea of being accountable and transparent, that people get to know the things that we're actually working on. We're also going to be consulting on mandatory corporate training. We want to find out if that's been effective for people. We want to talk about divisional training opportunities. Many divisions that are larger have their own training divisions, and so we want to make sure that what training they're offering aligns with our approach and our culture on how we view accessibility. We're also looking at, as we're going through and consulting with the divisions, what additional skills development is required according to people's roles. So for example, if people are publishing stuff online, they need to have advanced training on accessible document creation. If people are implementing bylaws and making decisions, looking at, for example, bylaw applications for cafe applications, they need to understand the implications, what accessibility means and who's going to be affected. People need to have additional training and understand how their parts of the work affect decisions that relate to human rights. So these are things that we'll be talking to people about. Also talking about a vendor accessibility strategy so that the vendors know in advance what our expectations are. Talking about a document accessibility strategy, something that encompasses accessibility of automated transaction systems, standardization of accessible document templates that makes it easier for people to create accessible documents so that we're not expecting staff to start from scratch, because that can be a fairly complex and technical expectation. We want to have consistency in the way that people create accessible documents. So the point is what we'll be doing is conducting systemic reviews. We've got a series of consultation questions that will be used to gather information about the underlying systems that contribute to accessible outcomes. I think I may have gone up a slide instead of down a slide, sorry. So this next one on the consultation topics is the feedback mechanisms and complaint tracking. So in fact, 311 actually does an excellent job in many cases. What their critical part of the role is documenting these things into a database so that we can start collecting information. We want to try and enhance that data collection so that we can use complaint tracking to identify areas where we need to address more resources. It helps us to know where there's patterns, where there's pinch points, where there's trends that are affecting more than one individual or multiple individuals. I mentioned earlier about vendor accessibility strategy. So we do have processes in place for accessible procurement, but we need to strengthen those so that we're not making requests to be compliant with the AODA, but rather we're making a request to be compliant with specific technical expectations so that it doesn't leave it up to people's guesswork on the end result that we're expecting. Other consultation topics include attitudinal and systemic barriers to accessible employment. Information and communication accessibility strategy, so the approach to identify and eliminate accessibility barriers in materials produced by the city or through contracts. So these are questions that we'll be asking as we go through each division. What do you create? Who creates it? Where is it created? Are you making new stuff every year? There's a huge opportunity for information and communication. It's not like the built environment where a building's going to be standing or a street's going to be there for 50 to 100 years before it might change. Information and communication should be capable of changing at a much faster pace. We'll also be consulting on the built environment accessibility strategy. Now, understanding that many divisions are at different levels. Some divisions have long ago, like Parks, Forestry, and Recreation, been doing accessibility audits of their facilities, while maybe some other divisions, it may turn out that they may not be as far ahead in identifying barriers in their built environment. So we want to find out where people are at with regards to identifying accessibility barriers in facilities, public spaces, including the public realm, and identifying opportunities to influence Toronto's private sector. While the AODA doesn't tell us we have to do that, we have a huge opportunity at the city not only to influence businesses through our procurement practices, but also there may be ways to influence the private sector, such as what was being discussed before about working with BIAs. So the approach that we're taking is obviously the two prongs, right? We either have to prevent barriers or plan for their removal. Preventing barriers is going to involve a considerable amount of training so that people have the new skills that they're required in order to be able to incorporate accessibility into everything they do. So we need to be looking at it from the planning stages of everything from procurement, whenever we're developing new programs, whenever we're implementing things, and also we need to be looking at the measurement and evaluation. A lot of times in a busy environment like a city, thinking of the best practices of plan, do, check, act, we often do a lot of planning and doing, but we need to measure and evaluate whether we're on the right track. So that will be, in some cases, for example, divisions may say that they have a process in place. Well, we need to check and see if those processes are working effectively. By removing barriers, we need to take a strategic approach. Again, these are things that I started to talk about earlier. So the barrier removal plan, we have to take, it's difficult, how do you bite this off with 44 different divisions and invite people from the public to come in and give feedback when maybe they don't know which division was responsible for the experience that they had. So instead, we're going to take the approach of what kind of attitudinal barriers have you experienced? Tell us about your experiences. We'll get to the bottom of where these things happen. as we're going through and talking about consultation, we need to be benchmarking these things. What are our attitudes in the city towards people with disabilities? And what can we do to move those attitudes forward towards being inclusive, removing ableism, stop making assumptions about what people with disabilities want? Systemic barriers would be plans and policies and procedures. So we're going to be asking people about, for example, did this procedure stop you from registering for something? Did this procedure or policy make it difficult for you to enroll in or participate in an activity, which may be, ranging from employment to, taking advantage of other city services. Information, communication, technology barriers. So we'll be looking at each division and asking people as well, what kind of experiences have you had? Where have you experienced barriers? Looking at each division, we're going to be asking, what kind of print do you create? Who creates audio, video, or do you get stuff from other sources? Are you hiring vendors to create videos for you? Those kinds of things will uncover the avenues that we have to prevent barriers and remove them. One of the things that's happening right now across all the divisions is looking at the web content. What content they have, what applications they're running, and are they accessible, because they won't be allowed to be on the new website once it's launched. So some of these things are already underway. Built environment barriers, again, asking for people to give us feedback, whether it's buildings, public spaces, public realm. So the approach to the barriers, again, is through this consultation. These are another series of slides talking about the types of barriers, the sources of barriers, and the best practices in identifying, removing, and preventing barriers. So with the attitudinal barriers, we have things like hidden or implicit bias, ableism, stereotypes, assumptions, and limiting other people's choices based on those assumptions or inaccurate perceptions. The way to remove those barriers, you first have to benchmark those attitudes and understanding, provide the awareness and training that's necessary, modeling desired behavior, creating opportunities for interaction and engagement with people with disabilities. It's not sufficient to just have policies and guidelines. They have to become meaningful. So we're looking at ways that we can give people opportunities through creating a community of practice with employees at the city that work on accessibility, so that we can do things like lunch and learns and have events where they can get interaction with people. By celebrating progress. So there's some really exciting things that are happening in the divisions, and sometimes we don't get to tell you about them until they're, underway. But for example, just to, wet your whistle a little bit, the housing or the shelters, for example, how we're able to secure some funding in order to audit the shelters. And that's something that they were going through an RFP process. They selected an accessibility auditor, and that accessibility auditor is expecting to deliver their results by the end of March. So we'll know a lot more, for example, about accessibility of our shelters, and therefore we can do better at planning for remediation. So we need to be able to celebrate these things as well. Evaluating progress and adjusting accordingly. So that's another area for attitudinal work. Those systemic barriers. So in some cases, we've done a lot of focus on built environment accessibility, but those systemic reviews would include things like looking at the bylaws. So are there certain bylaws that, or how do the bylaws work together to result in accessible street environments would be a type of systemic review. We need to develop those indicators of progress and have ongoing review and iterative improvements. So we might not be able to fix all those bylaw problems in year one, but as long as we have a long-term strategy that nothing is getting left behind. And also the feedback and complaints tracking and corrective actions. And I believe that our IT systems are good, but we have, as I understand, future goals of improving our customer relationship management tools. So as these things go forward, we need to embed accessibility in those so that we're able to track and get stronger data. The data is going to be critical for us to influence the decision-making process. So we want to make sure that the lack of data is not going to be a systemic barrier. I think the information, communication, and technology barriers, I've went through them, but again, we need to audit those barriers. We need to do remediation planning. We need to make sure that accessible procurement prevents barriers from new deliverables that we receive, and we need to develop the skills of people that are creating these tools. Again, on the physical barriers, a similar approach, auditing the buildings and public spaces, which has been underway and perhaps underreported, but has been happening. Remediation planning and accessible procurement, so that when we're getting new buildings are being developed or major renovations, that there's very clear specifics in that, and skills development. Also, as part of that process on the physical barriers, for example, our intention was to have a working group that reviews those, because there is a necessity, and that's in the in the corporate accessibility policy, that we put more focus on meeting our AODA requirements to identify barriers in site plans or drawings for new buildings that are coming forward. So we want to tighten that up so that we're not missing opportunities to prevent barriers. Now, consulting with people with disabilities. So the slide that's up right now tells you about the 4 different in-person consultations and the online survey. So it's our intention to start an online survey and run it from March 1st until mid-April. We're using a variety of different ways to promote that online survey through organizations that support people with disabilities. We've also got communications going out to counselors' offices so that counselors can, via the communication methods like email newsletters with their constituents, they can let them know about the in-person consultation opportunities or the online survey, and as well as our other methods of promoting this through the public appointments and other networks and channels that exist to get people out to the in-person consultations. So I would like to turn the floor over to the committee to get your feedback on some of the questions or some of the topics, your concerns and your interests. I should preface also to say that I did get contacted by our working group on information and communication and sent them some of our draft questions, our consultation questions, and received some good feedback from them. So there may be opportunities. I know that there was a working group that had been assembled called Housing and one called Transportation. I suppose we'll be discussing working groups afterwards, but it would be helpful to talk to get your feedback on some of these questions, consultation methods that are in our draft stages right now, and perhaps also develop or get some volunteers that want to contribute feedback to the online survey. So those will be things that we'll have to take offline as they're draft materials, but the working groups, the people that have volunteered for that will be ideal to figure that out. But in the meantime, questions and comments on the presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Turning it into the committee, those with questions, please indicate. Wendy and Tom. Wendy first.
Thanks, Nicole. Very interesting. I wanted to ask you some questions around the methodologies that you're going to employ. So your survey, can you tell me who is the survey intended for? Because it seems to have an extremely broad audience. So that's one question. Are there options for people who can't access an online survey? Mm-hmm. That's the second question. When you're talking about targeting the divisions, is that a series of key informant interviews, or how is that? Is that something that...
It would be really helpful if we could do the questions one at a time, because
Sure.
I've already forgotten your
Let's
first
start.
question. I'm sorry,
Okay,
but
so who is the survey intended for?
the survey is intended to be a survey of the public,
Okay.
people with disabilities. So there will be questions in the survey to identify their personal background as a demographic representation, and making sure that we have feedback from people with a variety of disabilities.
Okay. So is there an option for people who can't access an online survey?
Yes, we will put an option in place for that. It will be probably a phone option.
A telephone, so a number that somebody could call and you could talk them through.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about targeting divisions, you mentioned that a few times throughout the presentation. What does that look like? What does targeting divisions mean?
So what we're doing with the divisions right now is going through the city manager's office to direct the request to participate. So essentially what that will be is we've put together an AODA primer for key stakeholders at the divisions. So whether they be individuals that are responsible for resource planning, policy planning, or whether they are individuals involved in procurement or real estate or the development and dissemination of information and communication. So we want to have a multi-skills or a cross-section of the division and the key stakeholders from those divisions, so that we, when we go and meet with each division, we'll be consulting with them on the steps that they've taken to work on, like what their requirements were for the existing plan, anything that they have outstanding. We'll also look at some of the historical data. So, for example, under the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, there was other documents and commitments. So we'll be looking at, for example, what are some of the past commitments that they had made, as well as what they've done to identify barriers in attitudes, systems, infocom and technology, and the built environment. And it'll be a gradual, so the consultation questions will be kind of like a workbook that they'll need to go through. So some of the information they may know right away, some of it they may need to research, or they may need to look for additional data. And we'll be coaching them through that to find out where things are at, and then working with them on how we're going to develop the plan.
So thank you for that. One other question. Where do City of Toronto employees factor into this? So the population of people that work for the City of Toronto, how are they asked for their input?
I think that as far as the employees, I'm not sure how they, I don't think that they've been consulted specifically in the past development of the multi-year accessibility plan. We will be promoting the opportunity to participate as giving feedback as people with disabilities. So we'll be promoting that opportunity through other channels like our Monday morning news, so that employees get to be aware of this, the opportunity to participate if they are participating from the point of view of a service recipient. The city also does do, and this unfortunately isn't in my area of, but I'll be asking for feedback from the various different survey. So there's employee engagement surveys and count yourself in surveys, other equity and diversity surveys to identify what some of our historic trends are as far as how people are identifying, are more people identifying, so that we know that we're increasing the number of employees with disabilities in the city. And how are they reporting feedback as far as their engagement levels? So there were a couple of specific engagement questions to identify how they are feeling included or not.
So just to clarify, as employees of the City of Toronto, they can either participate in the online survey as a member of the public who has a disability, or you're going to use alternate data sources that capture other information about them as people, as employees with disabilities, but not particularly about their role in the multi-year accessibility plan.
I see what you're getting at, and I'd like to find a way to see if there are people that want to come forward and talk specifically about their experience as employees, because these are things that I usually collect on a one-off basis when people call our division with concerns about maybe complaints or concerns that they've had. So a lot of the feedback that I've had on that is basically conversational. So I could see that that we probably should increase our feedback from employees with disabilities on the experiences that they've had.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Tom?
Congratulations on a fairly comprehensive plan. I was very impressed with what I saw. One thing that came out of last presentation, or the first presentation today, is that there's a need for a consolidated look at the bylaws in a city, because from the user perspective, which is what we're representing here, it is very difficult for us to determine which bylaw is being trespassed and how many, and who do I call for it. That last example that I was saying about Kensington Market, it seems that within probably 50 feet, I would have had to call 3 times for the garbage bylaw, for the A-frame sign bylaws, for cafe bylaws, just to get down the street. And that's an impossible thing to do for someone with a disability, or to ask people with disabilities to be the police or the enforcers of these bylaws. So I'm just asking for something to be specifically stated in the plan, that the city will look at the bylaws and how they affect people on a consolidated basis.
I absolutely agree with you, that we need to start looking at the, as a comprehensive, what kind of barriers are people experiencing from a user experience point of view.
Right.
And just like some of the work that's being done to update our website, in our service delivery, there are sometimes many divisions that will have an impact. So for example, you brought up the issue of garbage cans, which brings in another division altogether.
Right.
Oftentimes there are divisions that are working in conjunction with each other, so we may need to make sure that there's a understanding between all of them on the outcome that gets achieved, right? So yes.
Do you have that bullet point or an executable promise in your plan, or that this will be done? Or is that just distributed throughout?
It will be consulted on. You have to understand that every division has to, we can give recommendations on what they should do. And so it's a complex issue, right? The consultation will be focusing on that, definitely, so that we can understand the linkage between all these different bylaws or different sources and how they impact a person trying to travel down the street. You commented on the bylaws, and I went through this with somebody on the phone recently. It becomes challenging because my recommendation to people is that it's a human rights issue. When we're taking quasi-constitutional human rights and bringing them down to the level of a bylaw decision, it makes it really difficult to have like a systemic change. So, some of these things may be bigger than just one bylaw, right? The overall impact on accessibility and human rights is the end goal that we're looking for. Under the AODA, we're trying to create accessibility, and that, then we start weeding into some pretty complex bylaws that have been around for a long time that we'll do our best to iron them out. But I'm not sure, I can't promise you what the outcome is going to be. I can promise you that it'll be part of the consultation process.
Okay, thanks.
Joe to ask questions, then Stephanie and Councillor Davis. Oh, and Darren. Joe, go ahead.
Well, this is a huge undertaking, this multi-year plan. I think the decision, the strategy to have 2025 as your end goal all at once in one plan is probably wise, because if you're to try to break it up, you don't know what you're going to run into. So I think that's good. But my question is, there was so much analysis of the city's processes and divisions going on. How many people with disabilities are actually involved in all of this analysis to bring that disability lens to it all? That's the question.
I'm not sure, because I don't know how many employees are people with disabilities, when you're asking that question, as far as...
So it's just employees involved with this analysis, or you're bringing in outside consultants as well? Because you mentioned the shelter study, you brought in a consultant.
When it comes to collecting the data, we'll be receiving feedback from people with disabilities from across the city as far as their concerns on barriers that need to be included in our plan for remediation or prevention. As far as, the multi-year accessibility plan, we'll be consulting with you again as far as the committee is concerned. And there are also a number of program advisory bodies within the city that work with specific divisions that will also weigh in considerably on their expectations. So, as far as when we're consulting with divisions, the divisions will be the ones that, whether or not they have people with disabilities in the room, but we'll be consulting based on the feedback that we're getting from the public, as well as the defined consultation questions that are prepared in advance that are, I guess the goal of these consultation questions is to dig beneath to ask about the underlying systems and procedures that that go towards contributing to how products or services get developed.
Great. Joe, thank you. Any other questions? Any follow-up question? No? Okay, thank you. Stephanie?
Nicole, I'm just wondering, in terms of the consultation questions and process, would you consider adding an element of asking frontline staff their experience and what they would like to know about working with persons with disabilities as well?
I think that is part of our attitudinal, like a benchmarking. I mean, we do need to find out if frontline staff feel prepared, feel that they're adequately resourced, supported. I think that that's a benchmarking strategy as well. The city is going through a considerable customer service improvement initiative. So again, one of the, as anybody knows, when they're trying to get funding and people to divert their attention towards accessibility, it can be challenging, in the very least, just to take that on as something all by itself. But there's some major works being done across the city. So the idea being that as we're improving customer service, we want to also embed accessibility as part of our, and it is, as you know, under the Excellence Toronto and having equity and diversity and human rights as one of the overarching goals of any Excellence Toronto work that we're doing. But that, yeah, it's, I agree with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Darren to ask questions, and then we'll come right to Councillor Davis. Anybody else who'd like to ask questions? Okay, Wendy.
Thank you for your presentation, Nicole. It's definitely a significant undertaking. I have 3 questions for you. I think one you may have already answered. Just in terms of the consultation piece, will the multi-year plan be coming back to this committee once the plan has been formulated and developed? And I'm wondering if you know a timeline around that.
Okay, yes. Yes, we will be coming back to you again. And timelines. In an ideal world, if everything goes the way I would like, I would like to be able to bring our plan to executive committee in June and council in July.
Okay.
However, that would mean that a lot of things have to have no bumps in the road.
Right.
We may need the extra time, and in which case that would mean that it would be in September, that because there's a break in the summer. So.
Right.
So worst case scenario, we'll be bringing this back to you again in May. And if, you know, I mean, it may be a better approach to have the discussions in working groups, because when we do work in working groups, we can bring forward information that's not publicly available yet,
Right.
and we can have a more robust conversation and dig deeper into. So it would be my my recommendation to dig into that in more in more, I guess, grainy details in working groups. However, we can work out how that comes forward, because obviously the public will be interested to hear an update as well. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question there.
You did.
Okay.
Thank you. My second question you also answered in your response around when the plan would be going to executive and to council. So thank you for that. And then thirdly, will the Information and Communications Working Group have an opportunity to review and respond to the InfoComm strategy that you're proposing?
Sure, we can do that.
Great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that would be beneficial, and I think the working group would welcome an opportunity to review it. Great, thank you.
Okay, Darren, thank you very much. Councillor Davis to ask questions.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here because I was part of the very original council statement and commitment and the original accessibility plan. So here we are again. Now, this was supposed to be reviewed in, updated in 2017, is that correct? Or for 2016?
2017 is when we would like the plan to start. Our last plan went to 2016. So
Right,
it would have
so-
been wonderful if we had had
No,
the,
but the legislation sets out every 5 years it's supposed
Yes.
to be reviewed.
yes,
Okay,
this is
so
our,
it's supposed to be implemented, any changes for 2017, so we're a little bit behind, would
Oh,
that be
yes.
fair? Yes. Okay, so we're not likely to see an implementation until 2018, is that correct?
I think that, some of the things are ongoing, so you're right. I think that you'll see an implementation at the end of 2017. What we can actually do on that may be things that are already underway, but we're a little bit behind.
So will there be a report, this report that is going to committee and council in the spring, will it also include recommendations for resources and staffing in order to implement it?
I don't think that it will be going into the depth of the resources. That's really part of a budgeting process. So I'm not sure if we're going to be able to have actual financial, resource numbers coming out of it.
I mean, the difficulty is unless there is budget that will ensure corporate-wide implementation, we can have all the policies in the world, but the silos of all of those divisions is very hard to crack unless there is sufficient resources to be on those divisions with adequate authority to require them to take certain action. So I think we need more staffing and we need more resources. And if your report doesn't recommend that, it's,
I think that,
or set it up in such a way, because for the last 3 years, we have noted through the budget process every year that there is essentially one staff person in the entire corporation of the City of Toronto. Thank you very much for your work. Or two, who are working on ensuring our accessibility policies and compliance with AODA by 2025 is in place, and many of us think it's not adequate. So, but we haven't been able to get our hands on to anything that demonstrates that we need more resources. So you've talked about training, you've talked about working to look at new ways of implementation.
So I realize it looks like there's only one person working on accessibility in all of the City of Toronto, but in fact, in every division, there's many people that are working on accessibility. I think that's something that will be more clearly,
Nashville wants us to know he's here.
something that will be more clearly sussed out once we go through this new multi-year accessibility planning process. And we've got quite a few people that are working on accessibility in every division. So for example, several people in pedestrian projects are focusing on accessibility. There's several people in Parks, Forestry and Recreation working on accessibility. We've got several people working on accessible elections. I mean, I could go through all kinds of divisions. The shelters, the shelters work to develop accessibility audits of all the shelters was several people working on accessibility. So I think what's not necessarily clear to people, but what what our goal is, so that we can develop accountability in every division, so that we clearly identify the stakeholders that are responsible and those that are working on different projects. And we have a responsibility to embed this in everybody's job.
So
This
how
isn't
is that-
this is about, people learning how to make their documents accessible, not me, or, there's a system being developed, for example.
What are the systems of accountability now?
Well, in which particular area, right? Because
For
it's
divisions
fairly
around
complex.
accessibility and implementing our accessibility plan as it stands now?
I think that's something that, having been with the city just over a year, is something that I'm looking forward to defining more clearly, because I don't think it's the same in every division as far as the
Because it's a
accountability.
corporate-wide, what my concern has always been is that we have a corporate-wide responsibility
Yes.
to ensure the implementation of citywide policies across all divisions. And there doesn't appear to be a way that those accountabilities to the center
That's right.
are reflected in any way that we can see what's happening
I agree with you.
on the ground.
I agree with you. I felt that when I came in and joined the city, there was some gaps, and we're looking at closing those gaps. One of those examples is by making sure that we have a corporate accessibility policy with everything under one umbrella, so that there is a clear understanding of all the people participating. And of course, whenever we make, under the AODA, whenever we make changes to the policy, or whenever we make changes, or there's changes in the legislation, additional training is required. So of course, the policy will necessitate, as well as the changes in accessible customer service requirements, will necessitate an implementation strategy that should align as well with this multi-year accessibility planning, so that we clearly have identified those that are involved.
So are there accessibility plans for every division?
I have to go back and check through and see which divisions have accessibility. Some of them have more robustly defined accessibility plans than others.
Right. Okay.
I'm agreeing with you that there are gaps, for sure. And we want to, and the gaps may not be in people doing the work, the gaps might be in documenting who's doing the work. And that's, what's become apparent is every time I work with a division, I'm going, wow, you guys are really, taking accessibility seriously, but it's not documented.
I've just left the Occupational Health and Safety Coordinating Committee, which I chair, and it's exactly the same issue. There are policies on health and safety and accommodating workers who come back to work with ergonomic adjustments in workspaces or other
Councillor
changes.
Davis, do you have a question in that?
Yes. Is your report going to make recommendations about corporate accountability centrally and ensuring implementation and a strategy to do that? Yes.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
And will it require resources?
Well, that will be something that we will find out if we have gaps in certain areas as we go through this planning process.
Okay.
And then we can ask for, clearly having the data is going to be a necessity.
One last thing. Could you add East York on the East York Civic Center on the consultation list of meetings?
We'll see.
Thank you.
It's, again, challenging to be in, we decided to try and divide the city into 4 quadrants to try and get the best coverage that we could, so if we go to East York, we can't go to Scarborough.
Why?
I think the request is noted. I'm just, in the interest of time, because we do have one more item that might take up a little bit of time, and I know Wendy would like to have a second round of questions, so hang on tight to that request from Councillor Davis, and maybe you let us know a little bit later on whether or not that can be accommodated. But I want to make sure that we get questions from Yin and anybody else who hasn't asked questions. Or Tom, you want a second round of questions? Okay, no problems. Anybody who hasn't asked a question, who's interested in asking a question. So that's Terry Lynn. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll acknowledge Yin, who has the floor for 5 minutes, then Terry Lynn, and then we're going to reopen it up, and Wendy and Tom will have some more time. Okay? And if Councillor Davis wants to jump back in there, she can, but I know we also have some motions that members are interested in introducing. So Yin, go ahead, please.
Just to be clear, I know Darren went through it, but I'm slow. Before you take your findings and your recommendations for the plan to the council, the city council and the executive, you will come back to us first? Or, like, can you clarify, like, when you say May, that's before you present it to the council and to the executive?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you very much. Terry Lynn. Questions?
Yeah, I know it's been mentioned a couple of times, and I just want to circle back to it. I feel like Wendy alluded to it as well as Tom in terms of, and most recently Councillor Davis, around just folks that are employed at the City of Toronto. So I guess circling back to it, I heard you say that you don't know how many people with disabilities are working at in the City of Toronto and what the nature of those disabilities are. And I know this committee has requested that on several occasions. So I feel the need to request that that happen again. You know, the city needs to know where it is in terms of accessibility and inclusion. And until we have a baseline idea of what that looks like, we're not going to be able to progress further in terms of inclusion for hiring at the City of Toronto.
Sorry, my microphone's over here. So we ask people to disclose in a Count Yourself In survey, to disclose if they identify as a person with a disability, but it's not mandatory to participate in the survey, and neither is it mandatory to disclose if they have a disability. And there are often a lot of people out there that have disabilities that don't identify as a person with a disability. Long-term wise, as far as our recruitment processes, when new software is in place down the road, we'll be able to track people's disclosure in the recruitment process and identify that, you know, that there's equity in getting through the recruitment process. I realize that, you know, it would be nice to have more data about our existing employees with disabilities. You know, certainly we're able to also look at metrics in other ways as well, as far as our costs associated with supporting people. So those will be, you know, other types of inputs too. I mean, I would expect that we're going to be providing more accommodations as people age, that type of thing, right? So that we know that we're accommodating people and retaining them.
I mean, it's been a long time, but I recall like requesting that the city do that. And then some feedback was given, and I remember that there was a commitment by the city. Like, am I wrong? There was a commitment by the city to actually have that data. So I hear that you've tracked something, but we've not, it hasn't been compiled, right? And because we've requested this multi-years now, I'm wondering what the actual barrier is, right? Because whenever you do statistics, folks are not going to identify that there's nothing wrong with that statistical method. That's always going to happen.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I've answered the question already, that there is a Count Yourself In survey where people have the opportunity to disclose if they are an employee with a disability.
Where's the data?
It's in the Count Yourself In survey. I'll be sure to circulate the link to, I think it was recently brought to council.
Okay.
So I'll be happy to circulate the link to that for you.
Okay.
And I believe that that particular group has asked to develop a presentation for the Disability Committee.
Yeah.
So we'll have to find out whether that would be in like March or April when they'll be offering a presentation on it.
Okay, great.
Great, thank you very much. So I recognize Wendy and Tom, and perhaps Councillor Davis would like to ask a second round of question. I'm going to just request that maybe the questions be kept a little shorter, the answers a little bit shorter, because we have one more item to get through. Okay, thank you. Wendy?
It's a really quick question. So in the presentation, Nicole, you had referenced corporate training, mandatory corporate training. And I just wonder if you could clarify for me, because it's still a question I have. Does this happen? Are you talking about evaluating mandatory corporate training that has already taken place? Or are you talking about investigating the possibility of mandatory corporate training on?
Yes, no, the AODA, we have mandatory corporate training, that people need to be trained on the AODA and the Human Rights Code as it pertains to people with disabilities, and those that have been trained on accessible customer service, which we need to expand now because of the changes in the accessible customer service requirements. So there is mandatory training taking place. We do track to make sure that people are, keeping up to, so that new employees, so that the compliance or completion rates are up where they need to be. But I think also what needs to be done is to benchmark and say whether this training has been sufficient, whether it's equipped people in the way that they can meaningfully support people with disabilities and understand when they're getting an accommodation request and who they go to when they need help to provide that.
Sorry, just one follow-up question. Mandatory corporate training, I understand what the AODA says about who should be trained, but is everybody in the City of Toronto given training on the AODA?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Tom?
Thank you. My comment has to do with the comments that Councillor Davis presented. I'm just sharing some of my past experience. In my last job, I was Director of Employment Equity and Diversity for one of the major banks at the corporate level. And we've actually faced the same question. Do we enlarge the corporate division for compliance, or do we find a more appropriate strategy? And it ended up that the more appropriate strategy was to divide the responsibility within divisions and then make sure that each division leader had it implemented or integrated in their performance measures, the compliance component. So the corporate strategy was just to get the message out and make sure that all divisions know that they are responsible for implementing AODA, and then support them in making it happen and measuring their progress towards compliance at the end of the day. The reasoning behind that was that if you enlarge the corporate structure of compliance, the divisional leaders will then say, oh, well, it's no longer my responsibility. I'm already paying for that corporate group to be doing it, so it's their responsibility now.
Tom, do you have a question in there?
Just a comment. I'm not sure whether that-
Hang on. We're going to get to comments because we're also going to get to motions, but are you asking Nicole whether or not she agrees with your observation from your previous
Yes,
employment?
that would be the question.
Employment?
Thank you, I do agree.
Yeah, and she agrees. Great, thank you. You'll have a chance to continue your thoughts during the speaking portion. Councillor Davis, question? And I think we're going to start to wrap up. No? No more questions. Okay, so one more question. Go ahead.
Our agencies, boards, and commissions, what we call our agencies now, I guess, they have different accountabilities and different obligations. So Hydro, TCHC, Toronto Public Library, so on. How are we ensuring their compliance, because they are our corporations and agencies?
They have individual responsibilities under the AODA to comply themselves.
We don't monitor them at all.
No.
That's a problem too, I think.
Well, they report to, it's a provincial reporting that they report, and in fact, this year, in 2016, I was working with and contacted by the Accessibility Directorate and asked to provide a list of all the contact information for all of our agencies, boards, corporations, et cetera, community centers, so that they would be able to identify those and make sure they're in the province's database for tracking themselves.
No, but we've had there was a big report in 2013 or 12 about how we ensure some kind of corporate accountability from those agencies, because people believe they are ours and we're responsible for them around other matters like, anyway, I do think that's a concern for me too.
Okay.
They should at least be reporting to us what they're doing. We ask them to send in other kinds of reporting.
Then maybe we can put a mechanism in place for the
Yes.
various boards that manage those. Like, for example, the TTC does their own reporting. They
Yeah.
report their progress to their board.
Absolutely.
You know, I believe that those are already happening, but really it's not within the, I mean, it's quite clear from the TPS bylaw that I don't have agent governance over the agencies, that they govern themselves.
Yeah, but we reach in and ask for accountability from those agencies all the time, and budgets, lots of things. And I think at least knowing, I mean, there's a separate set of AODA requirements for transportation.
And, yeah.
And I think the city needs to be assured that the TTC is meeting.
Well, I'm not, the TTC does report and show us what they're working on a regular basis, but as
But
far as
council doesn't.
compliance, they go through the province to report on their compliance with the AODA.
What I'm saying is, as a councillor of the City of Toronto Council that is responsible for those agencies and the governance structure we set up, I would like to know what they're doing. And I think in your report, you should consider that.
Thank you, I'll consider it.
Okay, thank you very much. Those two speak. I know Terry Lynn, I have you on the list. Do you want to go first? And then Monica. Terry Lynn, I know you have a motion and you want to speak. Move your motion first.
So the motion, thanks Janice for helping me draft it. It's a request to the city manager to consider the following when updating the multi-year accessibility plan. The first part is how City of Toronto employees are asked for their feedback in terms of the AODA plan. And the second goes more to what I think Tom was trying to articulate was that the onus of a more accessible Toronto not be on individuals needing accessibility, but instead on the city to proactively remove barriers to access in city services. So I'm open to feedback on part two, because I want to be clear that, well, if folks don't think it's clear, please let me know, but just that getting away from like the user complaining in terms of how the city responds, that kind of thing. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Are there any questions to the mover of the motion? Darren?
I'm just wondering if you can sort of clarify your second part of your motion, because I felt that Nicole's presentation was clear in the fact that the city is going to be proactive in removing barriers through this plan.
Okay, we've seen that folks have talked about needing to complain when there are accessibility barriers. And this, because Nicole's work isn't done, this motion just puts at the top of the mind for people creating that policy to make sure that they're being proactive in removing the barriers and ensuring that folks needing to complain is lessened because it's already been thought of from the user perspective.
I don't know, am I allowed to comment on this, Councillor?
Can I respond?
Sorry, I was just distracted. Darren, have you asked your question?
Can I respond to what Terry and Lynn just said?
It's not really an opportunity for us to have a
Okay.
back and forth conversation.
Okay, I will speak to her afterwards then.
Okay, well, you can actually have an opportunity to speak as well. But I'm going to put you on the list and you can speak afterwards, okay?
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions to Terry Lynn to clarify the motion? No? Okay, so recognizing our next speaker, Monica?
Sorry, I feel kind of silly after her motion, but I just wanted to comment and say that I support Councillor Davis on having an East York meeting. We are separate from Scarborough and we are separate from downtown. It takes us about 45 minutes to get to either spot. So just consider that.
I really wish I heard your comments. It's a little distracting when I have somebody speaking to me, but it was for good reasons. And Terry-Lynn, I'm going to loop back and offer you some advice from the clerk. Councillor Davis to speak, and I know you have a motion.
I was just going to type it and send it to Janice, but I didn't get it done. I can read it, and they can take it
Sure, or if you
slowly.
want to just hang on, we can ask Darren to speak, and I'll come
Sure.
right back to you in 5 minutes, maybe less. Go ahead, Darren.
Okay. First off, I just want to commend Nicole. I think your approach to developing a corporate accessibility plan policy is a good approach. I work for a municipality in the GTA doing accessibility with a similar structure to the City of Toronto. And we have found that having a corporate policy in place really provides clear guidance and governance to staff and how they're developing policies and procedures and how they go about complying with the AODA and its requirements. Secondly, just to respond to Terry-Lynn's, I think the second part of your motion needs to be a bit clearer in terms of staff being proactive and the complaints process. I think it's a bit vague at this moment. So right now, I don't feel I can support your motion because of that. So if we can just work on the wording a little bit to make it more clear, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Is Councillor Davis ready? Not.
I was just going to move a motion to direct staff to have a consultation in East York, but I haven't got that done. And maybe I'll just say really loudly and clearly that we would really like to have one in East York. We have found that we are on the edge of Scarborough. We're in this place where going to Scarborough Civic Center does not work and people won't come to Metro Hall. So it is in the middle of the city. And so we've had good attendance on lots of things that we have there when we manage to every time push to have an East York consultation. So I'll just ask once again if that's possible. I won't move a motion. The motion that I would like to move is that to request the city manager in the upcoming report on the updating of the accessibility plan to include the necessary resources and staffing to ensure corporate-wide training implementation, implementation, training, if you could do that, and divisional accountability and compliance. I don't know the answer about where the balance is between asking for divisional ownership over implementation. I know that's important, versus the balance between that and having central accountability. In a corporation this large, it is very, very difficult to ensure that policies are being implemented in each division. And we did find with occupational health and safety that it did have to be built into performance expectations for managers. And that was the one way that we ensured that they were delivering on the corporate-wide responsibilities. So I think something like that has got to be set out, but I still don't believe we have adequate resources centrally as well. So, and if we don't ask them to put in what the resources are, and maybe it should say resources and cost prior to the 2018 budget, so it signals this is a budget ask, then we're not going to get it. They're going to say, well, we can do it within existing resources. Well, we've been trying to push forward with the accessibility agenda, if I can say it that way, with no additional resources, when we know that our obligations to comply with the AODA are huge. And if somebody is not pushing every division centrally to make sure they do have all of their audits completed, I mean, I can't, the facilities division isn't finished its audit. And all we know now is that we have about $250 million of unbudgeted capital that is likely to come when they're completed their audit in terms of renovations. And that's just the built environment. All of the other requirements, we don't even have a handle on what those divisions are doing right now. What is not just baseline for people, but a baseline in terms of activity and what their activities will be to ensure compliance, and then how to do the training, and then monitor to ensure compliance and implementation. So we need both divisional and corporate resources, I think, to ensure that that happens. And I hope that this will help to do that. Every budget year we have asked the city manager, and other than to say, have you got enough resources to make sure we're doing what we need to do, we haven't had a handle on what's necessary. So be brave and push hard through this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Davis, for those words of encouragement. I know that, are there any other speakers before we start to conclude and get to a vote? No? Okay, so there is, from our professional wordsmithing staff, we have a suggestion to perhaps enhance Terry Lynn's motion. It's the second portion of the motion, and it's really just to add just a few words. What I'd like to do is just read the fuller recommendation, which doesn't take away what Terry Lynn wants to do, but rather just sort of reinforces it. Request the city manager to consider the following when updating the multi-year accessibility plan: the further recognition of the onus of a more accessible Toronto, not be on individuals needing accessibility, but instead on the city to proactively remove barriers to access in city services. And Terry Lynn and I had a conversation just off on the side, and she's agreeable to the friendly amendment. Okay, which she's making to her own motion. Okay, thank you. So I think what I'd like to do is see an indication of support. Number one, for Terry Lynn's motion. I recognize that, Darren, you said you were feeling a little uncomfortable perhaps with the second portion. We can also split that motion in half if we want to vote it on portion one and portion two separately. Or unless the amendment has now satisfied you.
It has satisfied me, so we can vote on it as a whole if you wish.
Okay, great. Then if that's the case, I suspect we can probably take both Terry Lynn's motion and Councillor Davis' motion as a package, and all those in favor indicate your support. Okay, that is adopted. Thank you very much. And thank you, Nicole, for your presentation. So we have approximately 18 minutes to complete item DI 13.2, which is the Disabilities Access and Inclusion Advisory Committee's working groups. At our October meeting, you'll recall, we established the working groups after some debate. Those working groups are now itemized as 4 in total under the topics of communication, employment, housing, and transportation. And I just wanted to, I guess, make a request. Some of the proportions of membership are not quite there. For example, Tom is going to be having conversations by himself on the transportation working group, and it'll probably be far more productive if we got him a few other members who are not necessarily serving on another working group, but really feel passionate about the issue around transportation. And of course, you have the responsibility of coming back to the committee, just like I report back on my activities as chair. You will self-select amongst yourselves as the working group, one person to chair the working group, and then to bring back a short report back at the beginning of the meeting. Terry Lynn, your hand went up. Are you wanting to volunteer?
Yeah, I had already suggested to, I don't know, when a few memos went out, and I responded personally a few times, just saying that I don't mind being on the transportation working group at all. as long as, Tom, you're willing to do the minutes.
That sounds like a reluctant self-appointment. So Terry Lynn, I'm just confirming you are coming on to the Transportation Working Group.
Yeah, if that's allowed. I'm already on a committee, that's fine.
Okay, so hang on to your thought, because I think Monica, who's just joined us, is volunteering herself for a position.
I am, but it's on the understanding that I'd be part of the employment group as well.
Okay.
I'll join transportation, but I really need to be on the employment one.
So let the record reflect that Monica is joining us on the Employment Working Group.
Yeah, and I'll do the transportation as well.
Great, thank you very much, Monica. We're so happy to have you back. And Yin,
I'm going to join the employment group as a secondary thing, along with somebody else.
Okay. Okay, so once again, our record will reflect that Lynn is now on her second working group. For those who are on 2 working groups, good for you. And Tom?
Given that the employment working group is not very robust, I'll let my step up that one, and I'll just stay with the transportation.
Okay, so Tom, I'm going to strike you from the Employment Working Group. You are now sitting on only one, and that's Transportation. So Transportation, I still have, anybody else who's, Martin. Okay, Martin on Transportation as well? Great. And Rahima. So Rahima, you want second responsibilities on housing? Okay, so wonderful. Now, Terry Lynn, you had reluctantly put up your hand to join the Transportation Working Group. We now have 3 members, including yourself. You make the 4th member. Would you like to stay on that working group?
I'll just go with it.
Okay, great. We should have done this in the open format much earlier. Okay, so our working groups, any other changes? Any other self-appointments? You can always ask offline, too.
Does everyone know when they do subcommittees?
They're being asked to self-organize, yeah. But if Councillor Davis, if you would like to join a working group?
I'm interested in the transportation one.
Okay.
Just let me know if you're meeting. I'm not
Sure. Okay. Another enthusiastic self-appointment. Okay, this is great. So I just want to confirm. So on Communication Working Group, we have Darren, Yin, Stephanie, and Rahima. Congratulations. Our Employment Working Group, this membership is now comprised of Wendy, Victoria, who's not here, but I know she had indicated her support, Monica, and Yin again. Okay, and then our 3rd working group, the Housing Working Group, we've got Joe, Terry Lynn, Rahima. And our 4th working group, Transportation, which was underpopulated, now is very well populated, Tom, Monica, Terry Lynn, Martin, and Councillor Davis. You're in for a treat if you're going to get to work with Councillor Davis. She'll have you busy. You've been indoctrinated. So I'm going to, and this is great, thank you so much everyone for your participation. We're already halfway through our second term here, and we're halfway through the term of the DAYAC committee, and it's good to see that we now have our working groups comprised with the right number of people. You are tasked and empowered to go have those individual meetings, so try to do some self-organizing out of the committee. We're going to ask that you go into those working groups and then perhaps develop a work plan and perhaps an objective mission statement for yourself of how you want to add value to this group. We ask that you also become the laser precision group that's going to spend extra time analyzing the files and the presentations as they come before us, especially as it pertains to your topic, just because I know you're all very busy. Oftentimes there is so much to comprehend, but any time that we have an opportunity to drill deeper, we certainly want to do that. And so with that, I tip my hat and thank you for your leadership. Stephanie, you want to join a group?
No.
Okay.
Thanks.
You want to offer some comments?
Yeah, well, just a question, if we could, as we are self-organizing and scheduling our subcommittee dates, I wonder if we could all share that information with each other, especially since some people are on more than one committee. Is that possible?
Yeah, I don't see why not, as long as we don't, if you can just make sure that all the information funnels through to Nicole and to Carol, I think we're good. And if you recall, last time Nicole had expressed that she couldn't be at every single working group, doesn't have the capacity, but I think that she can act as a resource person. If you have any specific questions for her, she'll be happy to have a conversation with you before you walk into the working group. And of course, once the working group meets, you have to self-appoint and elect a person to chair that working group. So that person will then be tasked with the report back process as well. Yin.
We like to meet on the phone, so can we access the city's conferencing line, not having to be here, you know what I mean, from our bedrooms or something? Can we have access to some kind of conferencing system so that we can conduct our meetings by phone, but not adding cost to ourselves?
Yin, if I can take the opportunity to take the question that you've just asked, and I'll move it forward, and I'll get you an answer within the week. Okay? But I think that's it should be fine. But it may be that perhaps our office will try to host the working group.
I'm just wondering, I'm trying to remember all the rules. Are we allowed, I know we're not allowed to discuss anything over email for the main committee. Are we allowed for the subcommittees? Okay, thank you.
Sorry, that was Kristen's head visibly bopping up and down. Couldn't hear it. Yeah, of course. There was a kink in my neck, but it wasn't as loud as I thought. Okay, so good work, everybody. I think we've had a really productive meeting. I don't believe there's any other order of business. I want to acknowledge that Nashville has been extraordinary, who is Martin's companion, and Nashville has his own name tag, which might be the only animal committee member that we have with their own name tag. Okay, so meeting adjourned then. Thank you.